asked. The answer was obvious. "A second guest is coming. Mrs. Bretton expects other visitors." On descending to dinner, explanations ensued. A little girl, I was told, would shortly be my companion, the daughter of a friend and distant relation of the late Dr. Bretton's. This little girl, it was added, had recently lost her mother, though indeed Mrs. Bretton ere long subjoined, the loss was not so great as might at first appear. Mrs. Home it seems was the name, had been a very pretty but a giddy, careless woman who had neglected her child and disappointed and disheartened her husband. So far from congenial had the union proved that separation at last ensued, separation by mutual consent, not after any legal process. Soon after this event, the lady, having overexerted herself at a ball, caught cold, took a fever, and died after a very brief illness. Her husband, naturally a man of very sensitive feelings, and shocked inexpressibly by too sudden communication of the news, could hardly, it seems, now be persuaded but that some over-severity on his part, some deficiency in patience and indulgence, had contributed to hasten her end. He had brooded over this idea till his spirits were seriously affected. The medical men insisted on travelling being tried as a remedy, and meanwhile Mrs. Bretton had offered to take charge of his little girl. "And I hope," added my godmother in conclusion, "the child will not be like her mamma, as silly and frivolous a little flirt as ever sensible man was weak enough to marry, for," said she, "Mr. Home is a sensible man in his way, though not very practical. He is fond of science, and lives half his life in a laboratory trying experiments, a thing his butterfly wife could neither comprehend nor endure, and indeed," confessed my godmother, "I should not have liked it myself." In answer to a question of mine, she further informed me that her late husband used to say Mr. Home had derived this scientific turn from a maternal uncle, a French savant, for he came, it seems, of mixed French and Scottish origin, and had connections now living in France, of whom more than one wrote de before his name and called himself Noble. That same evening at 9 o'clock, a servant was dispatched to meet the coach by which our little visitor was expected. Mrs. Bretton and I sat alone in the drawing-room waiting her coming. John Graham Bretton being absent on a visit to one of his schoolfellows who lived in the country. My godmother read the evening paper while she waited. I sewed. It was a wet night. The rain lashed the panes, and the wind sounded angry and restless. "Poor child," said Mrs. Bretton from time to time. "What weather for her journey. I wish she was safe here." A little before 10, the doorbell announced Warren's return. No sooner was the door opened than I ran down into the hall. There lay a trunk and some bandboxes. Beside them stood a person like a nurse girl, and at the foot of the staircase was Warren, with the shawled bundle in his arms. "Is that the child?" I asked. "Yes, miss." I would have opened the shawl and tried to get a peep at the face, but it was hastily turned from me to Warren's shoulder. "Put me down, please," said a small voice when Warren opened the drawing-room door. "And take off this shawl," continued the speaker, extracting with its minute hand the pin, and with a sort of fastidious haste doffing the clumsy wrapping. The creature which now appeared made a deft attempt to fold the shawl, but the drapery was much too heavy and large to be sustained or wielded by those hands and arms. "Give it to Harriet, please," was then the direction, "and she can put it away." This said, it turned and fixed its eyes on Mrs. Bretton. "Come here, little dear," said that lady. "Come and let me see if you are cold and damp. Come and let me warm you at the fire." The child advanced promptly. Relieved of her wrapping, she appeared exceedingly tiny, but was a neat, completely fashioned little figure, light, slight, and straight. Seated on my godmother's ample lap, she looked a mere doll. Her neck, delicate as wax, her head of silky curls, increased, I thought, the resemblance. Mrs. Bretton talked in little fond phrases as she chafed the child's hands, arms, and feet. First she was considered, with a wistful gaze, but soon a smile answered her. Mrs. Bretton was not generally a caressing woman, even with her deeply cherished son. Her manner was rarely sentimental, often the reverse.